Committee, when the community was discussing the advisability of the Superfund listing on the national priorities list. The Willow Creek Reclamation Committee, after receiving assurances that several things were going to happen, one is that the listing was going to be very focused, very small, would not expand, that work would be pursued in a timely manner, that resources were available, that there was a high likelihood that they would be successful with their efforts, and that they would be sensitive to the impacts on the community. And we were given assurances that that would happen. And so the Willow Creek Reclamation Committee basically took a position not to oppose the listing. So to stay consistent with our policy, which was not to participate in regulatory enforcement and call for it, that was the best that we could do. Best that we could do there. You know, it was a very difficult process. I mean, it was a hard decision to come to, because at the end of the day, you know, when it comes to Superfund listing, if you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. But to quote Mr. Wireman, one of the justifications was they were really the only entity at the time that had the resources to solve the problem. Now, it's not an unwillingness on the part of the Willow Creek Reclamation Committee to try, but you have to understand that for many, many years we've been engaged in, and I know there's a presentation on this later, in trying to bring about some kind of Good Samaritan legislation that would give us the comfort from liability that comes from touching a point source. And we haven't made any progress on that whatsoever. You know, the EPA has come out with a process for kind of streamlining the process whereby you can get an administrative order on consent or some other things like that. But at the end of the day, there's just too much liability involved. And the liability would force you to come into full compliance with the Clean Water Act. So maybe that gives you a little bit of perspective, and I think it would probably only be fair to
Thanks, Steve.
let you hear the rest of the story.
There are a couple different things. First, before we started having these drainages, these additional drainages up in Upper Cement Creek, say around 2005, we actually made a lot of improvements in the Animas Basin. We could see about 25, 30 miles downstream, we started having 4 species of trout where there used to only be 1 species of trout. We have macroinvertebrates that were more sensitive to metals moved far up the river. I would term that the Animas Stakeholders Group was actually very successful up until about 2005, 2006, when we started having these drainages up in the upper Animas. Beforehand, the American Tunnel had been treated. There was about 1,600 gallons per minute coming out being treated. Now we're in a situation where we have much less acid mine drainage up there, about 600 to 700 gallons per minute, but it's untreated. So up until that time point, I think this Animas Stakeholders Group has been very successful. In terms of a Superfund listing, the EPA made kind of a determination or told people in the community of Silverton and the Animas Stakeholders Group that they thought it could be listed maybe 3 or 4 years ago that it could qualify. So I think we're at the point, and this might have been, I don't know how long it took for the Willow Creek Reclamation Committee for them to kind of have this determination that it could be listed, and then, you know, how long it took them to actually accept that. There's a lot of discussion going on in Silverton at this point. We had a couple county commissioners here, and we have the mayor of Silverton here, and I think the administrator of the county, and we're just not there. I don't think the community is quite at that point, they're just in the learning stage still, deciding what they want to do with a potential NPL listing. The other area that makes it a little different is that with the Nelson Tunnel, I don't know if there's any really substantial PRPs, potential responsible parties. In the Upper Animas, there is a large potential responsible party. Now, they argue that they don't necessarily have that liability, but it's a very large company at this point. So that makes the situation a little bit different as well. I think the thing that, one of the things that has held people back in San Juan County is that there is a concern that once there might be a Superfund listing, that you wouldn't get any investment in the area for future mining. And there's very much an interest in Silverton and San Juan County in potentially reopening mines and getting mining going again. So, I'll just leave it at that.
We have a question over behind it. Sorry.
I had a follow-up question. I don't know if you could. Yeah. Just kind of to explore a little more what you just said, Peter, about the perceptions of Superfund listing and what that means for mining and economies and communities. Can any of you share some case, maybe studies or scenarios where a Superfund project was completed, and what were the results of that based on community economies as well as mining? What were some of the results?
I'm not sure how many Superfund actions have actually been terminated and ended in the country. There may be a couple. I think it's pretty rare.
Smuggler mine
All right.
in Aspen.
Aspen would be a good one.
Yeah.
There is a difference too, that if you have a Superfund action that deals with mine waste, that can be very different than one dealing with a draining mine. But I'll pass this on to Mike.
Actually, we have completed Superfund work around the country. There's a couple points to make. When the Superfund program started, there was no experience anywhere in the world with how to clean up giant industrial sites or mining sites. Everybody thought that could be done in a year or two. Well, it turns out it can't be done in a year or two, and it was unrealistic to ever think that. But a lot of people did think that because the dollars kept rolling. And so, first there was a learning curve. Well, everybody just had to learn that it takes some time to do this, and the communities have to accept that it takes time. Secondly, I point to Leadville. You know, Leadville, there were some, in my view, not EPA's view, but my view, we listed 35 square miles in Leadville. That's too big. That's the entire town. You know, it's everything. So everybody's engaged in the Superfund site, whether they want to be or not. That's kind of why this site was focused down. And then the third thing is, and it gets to both these communities, we didn't pursue listing here, and we'd been down here 10 years before listing finally picked up. I think the way to view Superfund listing is as one of many tools that are engaged in a watershed restoration project. Not the tool, not the only one, not the first one. Should not be the first one. As Peter said, a lot of work went on in the Animas for years. So Superfund ought to be thought of as a tool that can deal with some particularly problematic aspects of a watershed. And then finally is the draining, the hydrology. And we know this from all over the world. When you have draining adits, you got a problem. You just do. Hydrology is very complicated. Fixing draining adits, if you want to avoid a $10 million treatment plant and $1 million a year to run it, is very difficult. It's extremely difficult. And we are now starting to have a lot of success up and down the Rockies with source control. The Summitville, there's a plug. New World up in Montana, we put 5 plugs in that tunnel. And the ones that have been done are successful. There's one at the Dinero, and there's going to be one at Gulf Tunnel in Chalk Creek down by Buny, and Steve's going to maybe do the R&B. So I see that as a big future element of remediating draining tunnels, source controls. I think that's the future. There isn't any more money. There is no Superfund anymore. It doesn't exist. So any remedy put in place comes out of the taxpayers' dollars now. So anyway, just a couple thoughts to add on.
Actually, Mike, can you explain a little bit Superfund funding?
Superfund now, the monies, and Joy knows this better than me, but the monies that are allocated for cleanup, once you go through the process of a remedial investigation, feasibility study, decide on a remedy, which takes some time. Then funding that remedy is a totally separate process, a totally separate thing. EPA folks have to go back to Washington, make their case to a panel that then decides, yes, we're going to fund this or not. In Creed, it's a little different because this was not listed as a human health issue. This is an aquatic issue because drinking water wasn't affected here in Creed by the Nelson Tunnel. Frankly, that'll make it harder to get money. So the net result of all that is the future of $10 million treatment plants is very grim at this point because there's no money to do that. And then once they're built and operated after 5 years, the states are the very excited owners of these treatment plants and shifting the burden of running those over to the state. And as you might imagine, state budgets, they're balking just like everybody else. So it's kind of changed, and you know, I like to think it's a friendlier Superfund.
Just to add on to that, that is a concern, and Zeke brought it up too, is once you have a Superfund designation, you know, you're in for the whole enchilada. And that has been a concern that's been voiced among our group, is that, well, okay, we could go the path of listing, but if there isn't the funding available, there's kind of no other route, no other direction you can go. And you're just kind of you're waiting until you might get funding through Washington at some point to do some action there. Unless you have funding from a PRP that's willing to, that puts that money up. But if they're very unwilling to do that and it goes into court, that could take a long time as well. I should note that the Sunnyside Gold has at this point offered up $10 million so far towards a solution if it is not designated a Superfund site.
You know, and you asked the question, you expressed the concern is does it create a deterrent to future mining or future economic development in the community? And it can. The reality of the situation is that the Superfund people have some great scientists working for them. They do clean things up. You know, the fact that we can't point to a long list of projects that have been finished, that's not a real good statistic. There's some very complicated projects. You know, you have a water treatment plant, the terminology they use is in perpetuity. I mean, if you've got to operate a water treatment plant as a part of your fix until the sun burns out, are you ever done? You know, so that's not a real good statistic. But the scariest thing, the thing that does create a deterrent to future mining activity, to economic development in the community, isn't the Superfund, the cleanup, it's CERCLA. And that was Congress's mandate to recover costs for these Superfund projects. And those guys aren't scientists, they're lawyers. And with all due respect to any lawyers in the audience. And they're mandated by Congress to recover costs from the potentially responsible parties. And there's a definition of who the potentially responsible parties are. And common sense, you know, most people think, well, the potentially responsible parties are the people who cause the problem. That's not the definition. You know, the definition goes well beyond that. And so it's a concern. It's something that you have to think about. You know, there was a period of time in Leadville where people around the United States were refinancing their homes at significantly lower interest rates, saving hundreds and hundreds of dollars a month just by refinancing their homes. They couldn't do it in Leadville because any bank that would refinance those mortgages then became a PRP.
Well, you want to have banks as PRPs. That's really a good way.
Yeah. And so, you know, those are things that you have to think about it. As far as mining companies, and I'm kind of rehashing a debate that I had with a lady from Earthworks when we were talking about Good Samaritan. Mining companies are as good or better at cleaning things up than anybody else because they've had so much experience at it. And they're highly motivated to do it in cost-effective ways. But they take on a tremendous amount of liability if they touch somebody else's problem. And so you come into a community to crank mining back up. I mean, you have to find out, you know, what liability you're incurring just by trying to come in and engage in something that potentially could have economic benefit to the entire community and benefit for the company. But potential liability becomes one of your costs. So there's a lot involved in that decision, and that's why you move slowly.
I'd like to just make a comment. To be blunt, having a listed property in a mining district for a mining company, the perception is that is a deterrent. But what we're doing here in Creed is we're hoping to get rid of that stigma by working with the EPA to work together to solve some of these problems, because Zeke is right. Mining companies are good at today at cleaning up and managing their sites so you don't create more problems. So just wanted to let you know that we're excited about what we can hopefully do here, and maybe it could trickle down to Silverton and other areas.
I just wonder what people think about where we should be putting our efforts, whether it's local community level or funding wise, and how what people think on that, and whether. And we also talked a lot this morning about the Superfund sites and the time period it takes for different communities to connect to them, and just if anybody has comments or questions on that, thought it might be good for this panel because they've got a very broad perspective from that economic standpoint.
I'll just throw a comment on what you guys said. You know, around the west now, we are right smack dab in the middle of having to deal with draining addicts. We put those off for decades. And the solid waste has been easier to deal with. Not necessarily cheaper, but easier to deal with. So I think we're entering a period of source control for underground draining addicts. And we're not quite there yet. We know that some of these sites lend themselves to it and some don't. So could you just address that a little bit in terms of what kind of criteria we might be looking for at a site to see if source control is viable versus some that we could say, like Caribou down in Ophir probably is not amenable to hydraulic source controls. But I'm trying to get the whole process moved down the road, because not building treatment plants, we all know that. Those days are kind of over. Not that there won't be any more, but there certainly won't be many more. So we got to shift our attention to that. So what do you think is needed going ahead to just move that whole thing down the road? Other than money.
I mean, we've looked at a lot of sites. You know, I've been lucky to kind of look at sites from Montana all the way down into New Mexico. And I've written a paper, and it's available, and I've given it to a few people, and it's available, you know, through the National Association of Abandoned Mine Programs, of what we look at when we're trying to figure out whether, you know, bulkheads or source controls will work. So if anybody wants that, it is available. I've got it as a PDF, but what it is, it's sort of like it's a matrix or a triage where when you're looking at a mine site and you start figuring out where all the openings are, what the heck's going on, which ones are good for bulkheading or source controls, and which ones are not going to lead you down that path, which ones are, what types of physical and geologic attributes are bad for bulkheading. And it's, you know, it's pretty straightforward. So I mean, if anybody wants that, let me know. I can shoot them that paper or that reference or whatever like that. But it's sort of just what do I look for that is going to help me figure out if that's feasible or not, versus what's here that might be a warning flag and maybe this isn't the way to go. Because not all mine sites are amenable to source controls. I mean, I think we saw a pretty good example of that at Summitville. Yeah. It's huge, the rock is bad, the water's coming from everywhere. You know, somebody put a bulkhead in it and they made it worse. And, you know, I mean, that's a great example. We've looked at other ones where, you know, if you wanted to follow that source controls thing, it would just be really expensive and really problematic, and maybe not the way to go for watershed groups or, you know, local folks that don't have huge amounts of money.
I mean, one of the challenges with any of the sites investigating source control is actually being able to conduct physical underground investigations to understand flow paths. And so having a mine site, obviously, that's accessible to begin with, like for some degree we have with the Commodore mine, and say at the Mary Murphy after a significant amount of work. The capacity to go underground and investigate that really is one of the defining characteristics as to whether or not it scores high enough to be even capable of evaluating source control. Because at the Penn mine for 30 some odd years, yeah, source control might be an option, but until you can actually get underground and understand the geology, the hydrology, what the geotechnical properties are of the rock itself, you don't know what viable source control options there are. So I think that's a key, is going through an investigation phase just to be able to get underground to do a further investigation.
The other key that I think maybe you can elaborate on is the hydrology. And I think figuring out the hydrology of these hard rock mine sites is a huge challenge. We've come an awful long way in 20 years, conceptually. But bringing a suite of tools, which we now have a fairly standard suite of tools that we apply to these problems, they've been successful. But you can't do source control if you don't understand hydrology.
That's a great point, Mike. One thing I learned in 7 years in the grouting and water control industry as a contractor, you don't stop water.
No.
Every bulkhead, anything you ever do, you never stop water. You can't stop it. You just make it go somewhere else. And so what Mike is saying is when you look at a mine and you're thinking of hydrologic or a bulkhead or something like that, you need to ask yourself, if I put a plug in here, where's the water going to go? Because yeah, you're going to stop the water out of that tunnel, but is it just going to fill up and go into another mine? Is it going to come right around your bulkhead? You've really got to understand the geohydrology and the hydrogeologic implications before you actually close the valve and see what happens. Because you're not stopping water, you're just making it go back to some other pathway that it was following before the mine was there. And that's really important to understand how that's going to affect that area.
And then understanding that once you shut the water off, you might have to open it back up again.
Yeah. If it doesn't work the way you want.
Yeah.
Is how to bring that type of research into these more remote areas. And I mean, you kind of said it's not that far.
Right.
But just wondering what your perspective and as well as the regulatory perspectives on including that academic perspective and where that might fit into solving policy issues. Coming up with ideas.
So we started a partnership with Colorado College about, let's say, a year and a half ago, and we've done about 2 to 3 tours in the Curva Creek watershed. And it's not necessarily close to Colorado Springs, but they kind of approached us with interest in the watershed because we have such good partnerships with the private landowners. And they actually have a kind of campus location in Crestone. So they bring their students out and they stay there for several weeks, and then they've come up for tours in the watershed, and then we're working with them for this particular project for soil sampling and then GIS monitoring too of the whole watershed. So just working with the professors to see, where they can fit it in their curriculum. We get some exposure to the mining industry and the historic part of it and how it's affecting downstream water and stream water.
It's cheap information.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, my take on it is, I've doing it a while, and some projects are very appropriate for students, and at Western we're primarily undergraduate, so we don't have a lot of graduate student stuff. So I'm particular on what kind of projects that have big impacts, where I put them. Collecting data, that's fine. But on some of the bigger things, I keep them on specific tasks that they would be appropriate for an undergraduate, especially if it has bigger implications. So you gotta kind of have to be careful with that. Data is only as good as the care that you put into getting it. So.
I think, at least like in Peru Creek, I think sometimes the challenges associated with universities participating is there's very focused goals from a university perspective, or a dissertation or a master's thesis that may not address the larger scale goals of, say, an agency that's interested in cleanup. And so it's focusing those particular studies to help with maybe the bigger goal. And so a lot of it is coordination between universities and whoever the overarching entity is for that watershed, whether it's a watershed group or an agency that's responsible for cleanup, is trying to mesh the goals of the university, because they're not always the same. Somebody's interested in getting a PhD, they may not be interested in the watershed as a whole and how that piece of the pie fits into the larger reclamation of that watershed. So it's kind of coordinating that and getting everybody on the same page, because you have a lot of, somebody's out gathering data that doesn't really apply to the larger goal for the watershed, so it's kind of inconsistent with maybe the watershed goals.
For the 5-year review up at Summitville, we're contracting with CSU, and they're bringing students up to help do veg monitoring, overseen by a professor, gaining experience to do that. But on the other side of that, if everybody's been up to Summitville, that you probably watch the buildings, slowly degrade and begin to fall down. And the Rio Grande County owns the majority of the site up there with the covenants on where they can do stuff and where not. But one of the things I've been working with, going towards with the county, that Adams State College has their archaeological program, and that they have a summer camp up there to try to begin to study the buildings and do work on preservation stuff. So that hopefully next year we'll hear more about that.
It just seems like a good value for everybody to take home, though, that there's a very big educational component on some of these things that we look at as problems, or a burden. Where if we have that open mind of thinking about also utilizing it as an education tool, we're enhancing the knowledge base in the area, both locally, and abroad. That's going to help in 10 or 20 years when these people are in the industry, right? If they have that interaction early on.
Or just good educated citizens later. Even if they don't go into the industry, then all of a sudden you got people that understand what you're doing, and motivation.
Yeah, we've funded many graduate students over the years, including you. No, we're not Rory's only source of funds. But, we're probably not even the biggest, but we are one of them. But the point I want to make is this field, the hydrology of hard rock mine sites, has linked itself to some very cutting-edge research, because 25 years ago we didn't know anything. 30 years ago, the mining industry knew how to dewater and manage water. They've known that for years. But to manage water in the context of an environmental cleanup and source controls is a bit of a different beast. So I think the academic connection here is both practical, as Jeff said, you have to contribute to the overall goal. But there are many opportunities for some pretty cool research that moves the science along at the same time. And what you're doing is an example of that. With all the carbon-14 and figuring out how to correct for that DIC, DOC stuff, that's purely academic. That's not a question that really we're terribly interested in create that particular question, though we're clearly interested in the carbon-14 data. So I just want to make that connection. It provides an opportunity for some pretty good research, and at the same time needs to fit into, as Jeff said, what the overall goals are.